A U.S. Navy helicopter was flying a routine patrol, when suddenly a laser hit the cockpit. Not a warning flare, not a tracking radar. A directed energy weapon fired from a Chinese military platform. For a split second, the pilots were blinded. For several more, the situation risked spiraling into something far bigger. No missiles were launched. No shots were fired. But this moment brought two nuclear-armed powers closer to open conflict than most people ever realized. What happened next wasn't reported loudly, but it sent shockwaves through military command rooms on both sides of the Pacific. The helicopter wasn't on a combat mission. A U.S. Navy MH-60 Seahawk cruised steadily above open water, conducting what had been flown hundreds of times before, a routine patrol in a region where tension was normal, but escalation was not. The crew monitored instruments, scanned the horizon, and maintained altitude with practiced calm. Then, without warning, the cockpit lit up. A sudden, intense beam of light cut through the air and struck the aircraft directly. It wasn't sunlight. It wasn't reflection. It was focused, precise, and deliberate. A laser. Inside the cockpit, alarms didn't scream. Engines didn't fail. But for a brief and dangerous moment, the pilot's vision was compromised. Sensors recorded an abnormal energy spike. The crew reacted instantly, shielding their eyes and stabilizing the aircraft while trying to identify the source. Within seconds, training took over. The helicopter altered course and altitude, breaking line of sight while reporting the incident through secure channels. No weapons were armed. No return action was taken. But the meaning of what had just happened was unmistakable. This was not an accident. Directed energy weapons are not warning devices. They are designed to disable, disorient, or damage, and when aimed at an aircraft cockpit, they cross a line that every military understands. Back on U.S. Naval Command networks, the report triggered immediate escalation protocols. Location data, flight telemetry, and sensor logs were transmitted in real time. Analysts began reconstructing the incident frame by frame. The beam's wavelength, intensity, and duration pointed to a military-grade laser system. And its origin mattered. Tracking data placed the source near a Chinese military platform operating in the region. Whether ship-based or land-based, the conclusion was the same. The laser had not been fired randomly. It had been aimed, tracked, and held long enough to confirm intent. From a strategic perspective, this changed everything. Lasers occupy a dangerous gray zone in modern warfare. They can blind pilots without destroying aircraft. They can test reactions without triggering immediate retaliation. And most critically, they allow a nation to probe boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability. For the helicopter crew, the danger had already passed. For commanders on both sides, it had just begun. Because once a directed energy weapon is used against a crewed aircraft, the question is no longer what happened, but what happens next. And in regions already defined by power projection, surveillance, and mutual distrust, even a few seconds of light can bring the world far closer to war than most people will ever realize. Within minutes of the helicopter's safe withdrawal, the incident stopped being a flight safety issue and became a strategic alarm. Inside U.S. Navy command networks, analysts reconstructed the encounter second by second. Every sensor reading from the MH-60 Seahawk was pulled, optical data, infrared spikes, cockpit telemetry, and positional coordinate. What mattered most was not where the helicopter had been, but how deliberately it had been targeted. Lasers don't drift. To hold a beam steady on a moving aircraft requires tracking, stabilization, and intentional control. The data showed the beam remained coherent long enough to confirm that whoever fired it was actively following the helicopter's movement. That removed doubt. Specialists analyzed wavelength signatures and intensity levels, comparing them against known systems. The result narrowed quickly. This was consistent with a Chinese military-grade laser dazzler, a class of directed energy weapon designed to temporarily blind sensors or pilots without physically destroying the aircraft. That distinction made the incident more dangerous, not less. Because dazzlers are engineered to sit below traditional thresholds of armed conflict. They allow aggressive action while preserving plausible deniability. No explosion, no wreckage, no obvious trigger for retaliation. But every Navy understands the risk. Blinding a pilot for even a second at low altitude can be fatal. As the assessments spread upward through command levels, the language changed. This was no longer described as interference or illumination. It was classified as hostile intent. Rules of engagement were reviewed immediately. Not because the U.S. intended to respond, but because commanders needed to understand how close the encounter had come to forcing a response. Had the beam been held longer, had the helicopter lost control, had a crew member suffered permanent injury, escalation would have been automatic. And escalation between major powers rarely stops where it begins. Chinese officials, for their part, issued no immediate explanation. That silence was expected. Directed energy incidents are almost never acknowledged directly. Admitting intent would invite consequences. Denying involvement preserves ambiguity. But ambiguity does not calm command rooms. Across the Pacific, planners began asking the same question. Was this a warning or a test? Lasers are ideal tools for probing boundaries. They reveal how quickly an opponent detects, reacts, and reports. They expose command chains and response timing. They show how far a nation is willing to go before drawing a hard line. In that sense, the helicopter was never the real target. The response was. As days passed, the U.S. adjusted patrol profiles. Flight paths shifted. Altitudes changed. Surveillance assets were layered more carefully. None of this was announced publicly, but every adjustment signaled that the message had been received and understood. No retaliation followed, but neither did normalization. Because once a directed energy weapon is used against a crewed military aircraft, the precedent is set. The line has been tested. And the next encounter, anywhere in the world, will carry the weight of what almost happened in those few seconds of blinding light. Modern conflicts don't begin with explosions anymore. They begin with moments like this, quiet, deniable, and far closer to war than they appear. What made the laser incident truly alarming was not what happened, but what almost happened. In modern military doctrine, helicopters occupy a fragile space. They fly low, slow, and close to contested zones. They are essential for surveillance, anti-submarine warfare, and maritime control, but they have little margin for error. A momentary loss of vision at the wrong altitude can be catastrophic, and that is precisely why the use of a laser against one crossed an unspoken line. Inside U.S. command rooms, planners began replaying alternate outcomes. What if the beam had been held just seconds longer? What if the pilot had been disoriented during a maneuver? What if the helicopter had ditched into the sea? In every scenario, the conclusion was the same. The response would not have remained limited. A downed aircraft, especially one caused by hostile action, would have forced an immediate reaction. Search and rescue operations, protective escorts, heightened alert levels, and potentially a direct confrontation between U.S. and Chinese forces operating in close proximity. This is where the danger truly lay. The laser did not destroy the helicopter, but it compressed decision time. It introduced uncertainty into a space where clarity is essential, and it raised the risk of accidental escalation in an environment already saturated with surveillance platforms, overlapping patrols, and competing claims. In the days following the incident, subtle but significant changes appeared. U.S. helicopters began flying with adjusted profiles. Different altitudes, altered approach angles, varied timing. Patrols became less predictable. Assets that once operated independently now moved with layered coverage. These were not signs of retreat. They were signs of recalibration. At the same time, diplomatic channels quietly activated. Statements were exchanged. Concerns were conveyed. Language was carefully chosen, strong enough to signal seriousness, restrained enough to avoid provocation. Publicly, the incident barely registered. Privately, it was studied with intensity. Because this was not the first time lasers had been used in close encounters, and it would not be the last. But each use lowers the threshold. Each incident normalizes behavior that was once considered unacceptable. And normalization is how accidents happen. For Chinese forces, the incident likely served its purpose. It demonstrated capability. It tested response. It sent a message without triggering immediate consequences. For U.S. forces, it confirmed something more troubling. The competition was no longer about firepower alone. It was about control of escalation. Lasers, cyber tools, electronic warfare. These are instruments designed to operate below the level of open conflict while still shaping outcomes. They create pressure without visibility. They provoke without clarity. And they are dangerous precisely because they leave room for interpretation. One misjudgment, one overreaction, one pilot pushed just a little too far. That is how major conflicts begin, not with declarations, but with incidents that were never meant to go that far. The helicopter flew home safely that day. But the space it operated in became permanently more dangerous. Because once a directed energy weapon is used in the sky, every future patrol carries the memory of that light, and the knowledge of how close the world came to something far worse. By the time the incident reached senior leadership, it was no longer viewed as an isolated encounter. It was treated as a signal. In modern military strategy, signals matter as much as weapons. They communicate intent, test boundaries, and shape behavior without ever appearing on a battlefield map. The laser incident was studied not only for what it did, but for what it was meant to say. For U.S. planners, one conclusion stood out clearly: this was a controlled demonstration. The laser had been powerful enough to be dangerous, yet restrained enough to avoid immediate disaster. It was aimed long enough to confirm capability, but released before triggering an unavoidable response. That balance suggested discipline, not recklessness, and that made it more concerning, because disciplined actions are deliberate actions. Across the U.S. Navy and Joint Command structures, discussions shifted toward precedent. If lasers against helicopters became normalized, what came next? Surveillance drones? Crewed patrol aircraft? Transport planes? Each step would push the boundary further, increasing the chance that one day restraint would fail. Doctrine began evolving quietly. Pilots received updated guidance on laser exposure and evasive maneuvers. Crews were briefed on recognizing directed energy attacks faster and reacting without hesitation. Commanders refined thresholds, defining when an incident remained an incident and when it became an act requiring immediate response. None of these changes were publicized, but every one of them reflected a deeper concern. The margin for error was shrinking. On the strategic level, the incident reinforced an uncomfortable reality. The rivalry between major powers was no longer confined to clear acts of aggression. It now lived in gray zones, where actions were aggressive enough to intimidate, but ambiguous enough to deny. Lasers fit perfectly into that space. They leave no debris, no impact crater, no unmistakable proof for headlines. Yet the consequences can be just as severe. Diplomatic messaging continued behind closed doors. Carefully worded warnings were delivered. The message was clear but restrained. Actions that endanger aircrews would not be ignored, even if they fell short of traditional definitions of attack. Whether that message was accepted, or merely noted, remained uncertain. What was certain was this: every future patrol would now carry an added layer of tension. Pilots would scan not just for missiles or radar locks, but for invisible beams capable of changing everything in an instant. The helicopter incident became part of training scenarios, war games, and strategic planning discussions. Not because it ended in disaster, but because it didn't. History often turns on moments where catastrophe was narrowly avoided. Those moments redefine expectations. They adjust risk tolerance. They change how far nations believe they can push without consequence. And once those expectations shift, the entire landscape becomes more volatile. The laser that struck the helicopter never caused a crash, but it altered the rules of engagement in the sky. And when rules change quietly, without public debate or declaration, the next incident is rarely the same as the last. In the years to come, the laser incident would be remembered not for what it caused, but for what it revealed. It exposed a new reality of modern confrontation, a world where conflict no longer begins with explosions, but with calculated restraint, where nations push against each other not to start wars, but to test how close they can come without triggering one. The U.S. Navy helicopter was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be felt. A beam of light, silent, invisible to most, and gone in seconds, was enough to alter patrol doctrine, shift strategic assumptions, and inject new tension into an already crowded sky. That alone demonstrated the power of gray zone warfare. Because in today's battlespace, perception matters as much as firepower. For military planners on both sides, the incident reinforced a dangerous lesson. Escalation no longer requires intent. It only requires miscalculation. A pilot startled at the wrong moment. A commander interpreting data under pressure. A response launched too quickly, or withheld for too long. This is how accidents become history. Lasers, electronic warfare, and cyber interference are now tools of competition precisely because they sit below traditional red lines. They allow pressure without accountability, aggression without attribution. But every use narrows the margin for error. Each encounter builds on the last. Each harmless incident redefines what is acceptable. And eventually, someone crosses a boundary not realizing it has already moved. That is the true danger revealed by the helicopter incident. Not that war nearly began that day, but that the system allowed it to get so close without anyone fully realizing it. For the crew, the mission ended like any other. They landed safely. They filed reports. They moved on to the next task. But the environment they returned to was no longer the same. Every future patrol would now carry an unspoken awareness. The threat was no longer just radar locks or missile warnings. It was light itself. Across the world's contested airspace and seas, similar encounters continue to happen, quietly, deliberately, and often unreported. Each one adds pressure to a system already stretched thin by rivalry and mistrust. No one wants war. But history shows that wars are rarely started by desire. They are started by moments. Moments when restraint fails. Moments when signals are misread. Moments when someone believes the other side will back down, one more time. The laser that struck the U.S. Navy helicopter did not ignite a conflict, but it illuminated something far more unsettling. How fragile peace has become in an age where war can begin without a single shot being fired. And how close the world now flies to the edge. Every single day.